What's up, world? Iceman back at it again. Yes, you know I'm back at it again. Here to teach you how to get the most out of your camera. I know it's frustrating when you have an idea and you just want to execute it, right? We could look at the manual to figure things out, but that takes time. A lot of time we don't have, because time is money.
You want $500?
Basically, this is a quick guide on how to understand how to use the settings on your camera to get the best results for your projects. And a little disclaimer, this is going to be done on a Sony camera, but in general the settings are usually the same. Most cameras have aperture, ISO, shutter speed, white balance, exposure, etc, etc. But no more wasting time, let's do it to it. Now to begin, we have to start with exposure, and what that is, to put it simply, it's the amount of light that reaches your image sensor. So basically it means how bright or dark your image will be, along with how deep or shallow your depth of field is, and at the same time how quick or fast your shutter is. I know if I'm speaking a lot and this doesn't sound familiar to you, it will make sense in a second, I promise. See how the image on the screen gets darker and lighter? Now the image is even. See that? I know you're probably like, what did I do to get that? Or how to get my picture to look like this? What settings do you put in? What do you put in this type of situation? And really, I could tell you what I did, but it might not work for what you're doing on a different project or in a different scenario, if that makes sense. See this number right there? You want this to stay at 0 or around that range, because that's our exposure compensation. Every camera has this. I mean, you have to, because your camera is letting you know that the image is too over or underexposed, and that is not a good thing. This is like a warning whether you're too hot or you're too cold when it comes to taking pictures or recording video. We want to usually be in the range of, it's more than just putting in the right settings to match my results. We have to understand what these settings are doing to achieve the image we want, and that's knowing how to find the correct exposure for the situation that we're in. Figuring out how to find the correct exposure is knowing that there are 3 key things that will help us do so, and that is aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So let's start with aperture. Aperture is how much light is allowed into the lens that travels through the body and then hits the camera sensor. So basically it's how wide or open or closed the lens is and how fast the light is traveling through to get to the camera sensor. See, when this happens, this is measured in f-stops or f numbers. How we figure this out depends on what type of lens you are using. This also controls your depth of field view. When you open your aperture, the more shallow depth of field you get. When you start to close it, the deeper depth of field you get, which is basically means is how in focus or out of focus your image will be. So let's sum this up. The shallower depth of field equals barely any focus, and the deeper depth of field equals more things that are in focus. Shutter speed is basically what it sounds like. It's how fast the camera shutter is opening and closing when you're taking a picture or you're filming video. The duration of how long the shutter is open or closed is determined by time, and that time is usually measured by seconds or fractions of a second. Here's an example of what these numbers look like. You have 1/100th of a second, then there's 1/200th, 1/250th, and so on. The lower you go in terms of fraction of a second, the quicker the shutter will fire, resulting in capturing more images or frames per second. The higher you go in terms of second, for example, 1, 2, 5, 15, and so on, it'll take longer for the shutter to close because it will be open for however long you set the duration to. This will start to introduce motion blur if things move in front of the camera when the shutter is open for a long period of time. So let's sum this one up. The lower number, or fraction of a second, equals fast shutter speed. This is usually great for sports or capturing action.
Football!
The higher the number, in terms of seconds equals slower shutter speed, or you'll get high motion blur, and this is typically great for long exposures. So either of these going up or down can be a good or a bad thing, just depending on what you're doing. Lastly, here we are. We're in the final stretch, boys and girls. Let's talk about ISO. So first, what is it? ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. That's basically what it is. And that's measured in, yes, you guessed it, more numbers. That's right. What's special about these numbers is that they make your picture brighter or darker depending on your situation. This is just adding light to your scene or your scenario when there's not enough sufficient light to be used to help accentuate your picture. ISO is really measuring the amount of light hitting your sensor and how sensitive your camera will be to that light. As the number goes up, the more light is introduced to brighten the image, but that also brings along artificial noise that can ruin the details in your image. The lower you go, your camera sensor is less sensitive to light, but this could be good or bad depending on the circumstances. And to sum this one up, the higher you go equals the more sensitive and more noise shows up in your image. And the lower you go as far as your ISO sensitivity equals the less sensitive your image sensor will be to light and the details in the image retained. So in a nutshell, that's how exposure works, surrounding those three main factors, which are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Let me know if you thought this video was helpful or it helped you out, or you want me to go deeper on these three factors when it comes to exposure or the exposure triangle. But until then, I'm Iceman, and I'll see you in the next one. Heroes now, heroes forever, heroes united. Peace.